Welcome to Staying Connected, a podcast where I talk to people about their stories with VEDS, Marfan, Loeys Dietz, and related vascular and aortic connective tissue conditions. The views, information, and opinions in this podcast are those of the individuals involved, and the information presented does not constitute medical or other professional advice or services. Welcome back. Today we're going to talk to Marisa Hart, who was diagnosed with Marfan syndrome as a child. Marisa has an extensive family history and shares how Marfan syndrome has impacted her life, from sports to seeing family members deal with Marfan syndrome, and her daily life and her own surgery for pectus excavatum. Quick note, in this episode there is a brief discussion about suicide. Please listen with care. Before we jump into the interview, if you like this podcast and you want to support our community and our efforts to raise awareness through this show, you can buy merch in my Printify pop-up store, make a one-time donation, or support the show by joining my Patreon. This show wouldn't be possible without the continued support of my Patreon subscribers and donors, so if you've already been supporting the show, thank you. Check out the episode show notes for links to ways to support the show. Let's get into the interview with Marisa. Hey Marisa, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast to share your story with Marfan syndrome. Do you want to introduce yourself to anybody who doesn't know you yet?
Of course, yeah. Hi, I'm Marisa Hart. I'm 27. I live in Atlanta, Georgia. And like you said, I have Marfan syndrome, and I do have a family history of it on my mom's side, going back to at least my great-grandfather's side. That's kind of where it starts. And now a lot of people in my family do have it now. But yeah, it's a long family history. There's never been a before or after mark of the diagnosis or anything. It's just been something that's been pretty constant in my life.
Yeah. So you grew up knowing that you have Marfan syndrome?
Yeah, I don't think I really registered the name of it at first. I remember going to cardiologist appointments a lot growing up, but when I was little, I didn't think much of it because, when you're younger, you always have to go to your checkups and, you get all kinds of shots, all kinds of examinations. And I kind of thought it was kind of in line with that, but I think it was probably around eight or nine. I think I realized I was the only one who got those doctor's appointments to cardiologists. I always thought they take pictures of my heart. That's kind of how I remember it. And then the Marfan syndrome, the actual name, kind of became common in my life when I was probably around 11 or 12. And that was when I had to quit playing soccer. I grew up playing soccer. I consider myself really good at it. I played at the rec level, but I was at a point where, club teams really wanted me. And, that year at the cardiologist, they said, can't play anymore because of the Marfan syndrome is too risky. It's not worth it. We're done. And that was definitely a very hard blow. I moved from California to Georgia when I was about 8. And it was a big adjustment, but having the team environment, just from the jump, made such a big difference. And just not having that was so hard. Just kind of 0 to 100, complete stop in my tracks. Just that one was really hard.
Yeah. Had your aorta grown to a certain size when they said no more soccer, or was the plan, always to have you play soccer until you were almost a teenager?
Well, I don't think my parents actually knew how much of a issue it would be. I don't think they really understood the full danger of it, because it was the thing of on the outside you look normal and healthy and you're doing all these things. How can anything really be wrong with you? So I think it was kind of just the plan was she plays, she's healthy, and there's quote unquote nothing wrong with her. So she'll keep playing as long as she wants. And, high levels, anything that's not an issue. I remember I was talking about it with my dad a couple of years ago, actually. And, when he tells the story, they said, you can't play soccer. And he said, okay, for how long? Because he didn't understand that this was
forever,
a very, very serious thing. But yeah, I think that was a very crushing blow for all of us to just not have that outlet that meant so much to me.
Did you get into other activities instead around that age, or how did you deal with that?
It took some time. So this was the beginning of middle school. I tried things kind of recreationally, not really at a serious competitive level, even though, people my age were kind of getting into more serious activities. And that was kind of hard to kind of be this novice beginner, not knowing anything while people were getting more serious into sports.
Yeah.
I did try color guard with the flags in high school, and I made some friends there, but nothing really resonated with me until I got older. I kind of was always like a bookworm. So reading was always kind of this one consistent outlet that I grew up with. Sports was kind of a sore subject for a bit until I was in high school. And then I got really into it just kind of as an outlet, a way to meet people, just watching sports. I mean, being a fan.
Mm-hmm.
More recently, really the more creative endeavors have been really meaningful for me. I've been really into knitting, kind of designing my own knitworks. I've been writing more, kind of stepping into that a little bit more. And those have been really meaningful for me, and just finding different outlets like that kind of really keep me busy.
Yeah.
But it did take a lot of trial and error, and I say wasted time. I know people are like, oh, you have to heal, you have to grow, you need that time. But I was bitter for a bit of just okay, I don't have this. Okay, let's try this. Oh, well, that doesn't fill the hole the same way. And yeah, trial and error, a lot of time, but I'm happy of where I am now.
Yeah. Do you want to dive more into your family history?
Of course, yeah. So I knew my mom and I kind of had the same thing. So I knew my older brother didn't have it. And I did, again, just didn't really talk a lot about it. We didn't talk about the significance of it until later. And that's kind of when I learned that before we got a diagnosis or really had anyone in the family had any idea of what was going on. We did have several people die from aortic dissections. Kind of everyone had a slightly different diagnostic story, I guess you could say. It wasn't really necessarily a domino effect of, one person gets diagnosed and, it kind of sets off a wave, so to speak, of people getting diagnosed. It was kind of all very independent of each other, which is interesting. So I did have a great aunt who they didn't specify. It was kind of before the Ghent criteria, the diagnostic criteria was a thing, but they did notice an aneurysm that she got fixed. And then it was one of those temporary fixes that she never got looked into again. And she ended up passing away. My family is, my mom's side of the family is of Mexican descent. So there were some barriers as far as language and getting the consistent high quality healthcare that is really needed for any kind of chronic condition, especially something that is kind of uncommon. So that was kind of an issue. I have great aunt or great aunt. I don't remember whose sister or whose aunt she is, but I did have someone who had all these symptoms too. And instead of really going, she just kind of didn't understand the gravity of it and never went to a doctor. She didn't really trust the doctors, didn't really know the significance of it, even in the United States. And she ended up passing away from a dissection. I know my mom has had to advocate for a lot of our family and do a lot of the translation services, but those kinds of issues of language and economic status has been kind of an issue. And I do consider my family particularly lucky, especially my mom and my aunt, because it was literally one person in a welfare clinic knew the symptoms, kind of knew the Ghent criteria, and was like, you guys have all these.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah. So really I'm very sensitive to understanding that this is definitely not the standard for people when they get a diagnosis. Sometimes it can be, a lot more tragic, a lot more painful to get a diagnosis like that. So yeah, it's not lost on me that this is a bit of a unordinary way to get the diagnosis, but yeah, I'm just fortunate that it was caught early.
Yeah. And I find it so interesting that the person at the welfare clinic knew about Marfan syndrome and the Ghent criteria and knew to bring that up. And it feels incredible, but honestly, that should be the norm, right?
Right, for sure. And I know even now people who have, access to great healthcare and, they might not have all these symptoms and they don't get the same experience. And it's not necessarily any kind of systemic issue. It's just, maybe the doctor is not as informed on this uncommon condition. Mm-hmm. Or, I know I've met several people through the John Ritter Foundation where they've had the doctor just kind of straight up say like, oh, you don't seem like the person who would have this. So even whether it's well-meaning doctors or not, it's just, a lot of people don't get the diagnosis until something bad happens, which it hurts to think about.
Yeah.
Like how lucky we were and how this is just not everyone's experience.
Yeah. Did your mom have to have aortic surgery?
She did, yes. So this is interesting. I didn't know this until very recently. Even with knowing Marfan syndrome, I don't know why, but she just didn't know, like nobody really communicated with her how dangerous this was until she had the aneurysm when I was about 15, which was in 2012. Mm-hmm. I forget how old she was, but she was like late 40s, I want to say. And she had a pretty, like the surgical, like open, like split open her chest kind of thing. She had that in 2012. And actually a couple months ago, September of 2024, this year, she had her second aneurysm repaired. This one was the descending. The first one was the ascending. This one was much less invasive, fortunately, and she's made a full recovery both times. But she's had that. I've had, I have an older cousin who's had multiple aneurysms repaired, an aunt with a valve replaced. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that it's not uncommon for some of my family members to have like 2 aneurysms that need intervention. But again, because we are aware of this, we're able to really keep an eye on it.
Yeah. At what point? So, I mean, if I'm trying to put myself in your shoes as 11-year-old, 12-year-old, can't play soccer anymore. And then I think you said you were 15 when your mom had her surgery, right?
Right. Yeah.
And you have significant family history. Like, how did that affect you growing up? Like with family members who were going through this stuff, did it ever feel like, like I have the same thing? Yeah,
definitely. It was very jarring to be in that position. Actually, my dad was kind of in the middle of being overseas. He was in, I think, Afghanistan at that point, actually. He did get some time off after the surgery, but, he left and my mom still had a long recovery and I was kind of the person to step up. So I definitely got like an up close, experience there of what that was like as far as the recovery and the caregiving. And it was definitely just very difficult to know, like, this is probably going to be you. And sorry if my voice cracks, but it's definitely hard. But I would say since then I've made peace. But like, I think back of being like 15 years old or just being that young and just like having to really come to terms with that.
Yeah. Yeah. How did you start meeting other people with Marfan syndrome when you were a teenager, or outside of your family, or?
No, not even until recently, with maybe the past like year or two. Mm-hmm. I really, again, it was kind of just like a lot of teenage angst and a lot of bitterness about the whole thing. And I just was like, talking to other people with this, it's not going to change my situation. I think that was kind of the mindset I had. It was like, this is not going to undo anything. It's not like something that's ever going to go away. And I just never tried for the longest time until, really, again, within pretty recently, I had surgery to fix the pectus situation, the sternum that kind of dips in. That recovery was really long, and I connected with Lauren Brill, who runs the Unsealed Project, and I did a little like a letter, kind of like a blog post sort of thing. And I started working at Emory University with the Alzheimer's centers and kind of seeing the impact of community engagement and community connection. And that kind of led me to both the John Ritter Foundation and the Marfan Foundation. And, teenage me was very, very wrong. Connecting with people who have these similar experiences is just great. Even just like the most like validating thing of just like, I need a rest day. I'm like, that is so true. Like, I do need a rest day sometimes. And just like hearing those experiences has made a huge difference.
Yeah, that's so, so good. And, you mentioned in there your pectus surgery. Let's talk a little bit more about like the physical features that you have of Marfan syndrome and kind of dive into that, because this is an audio podcast, so people can't see you. What physical features of Marfan syndrome do you have, and how does it affect your life day to day?
I did have a general primary care doctor who said I was like the textbook Marfan case. So what that means is I'm tall, I have the very long limbs, the long fingers, my vision's bad, my teeth are crowded, the roof of my mouth is arched, and growing up, I always had the sternum that was like severely indented. And what I tell people is kind of funny is like, I didn't know it was supposed to be flat until like the diagnosis. And I kind of just went down that rabbit hole of like, what is this? Like, why can't I play soccer? And I remember seeing like the breastbone, either it sticks out or it caves in, and mine's always caved in. So I saw that and I was like, well, as opposed to what? Like, is it supposed to be flat? It is supposed to be flat. I didn't know that. But yeah, I do have all those kind of textbook features, mild scoliosis, a lot of the back pain. The pain lately has kind of been a bit of an issue, and my voice might crack again, but I am kind of surprised at how like downhill things can go. Like, it's like one day I just can't do something the same way. I went to a concert back in July and my back has just kind of not really been the same. But yeah, it's just like, I've always felt like I was in a much older body, the way the pain kind of hits, especially in like the cold weather or like the storms kind of come down here in the South. And it's like, I would always get like hip pain or back pain. And I had a coworker at my last job, and she would always get headaches in the weather. And she'd be like, I have a headache and I think it's the weather. Like, does your hip hurt? But yeah, the pain has been more of an issue, but I do have the very classical features of that. If you know a lot about Marfan syndrome, you can pick me out of the lineup for sure.
How do you deal with that pain, or like what, I guess for people who are listening who have similar symptoms and are dealing with that pain, like, is there anything that helps with that, or how are you moving forward with that?
I would honestly say it's such more of like a mental thing. It's always just kind of planning ahead, and like, like in the disabled literature, we talk about like having enough spoons for things, and being a spoonie, like basically rationing your energy or your high effort activities, kind of planning those things ahead. And I do have to do that, especially with age or just like the stress of certain times of year, certain things going on at work or in life. I just have to really take care of my physical health, which is like, so cliche, but like even down to the things of what things people my age are doing. Like, they might go out and, they might drink a lot, they might party. People might not be too concerned about their diet, where as if I have fast food 2 days in a row, like all the salt makes me so inflamed and everything hurts. And, if I drink too much, then it sucks all the water out of my joints and I can't even straighten my arms all the way out. Mm-hmm. So it's just constantly being mindful of like, I'm doing something I don't normally do. How am I going to feel tomorrow or 2 days from now?
Yeah.
So it's that mental evaluation kind of thing.
Yeah, I'm glad that you explained the spoon theory, because I've heard so much about that too, and it's so important to manage your spoons.
Yeah, well, when you have like a chronic condition or a disability, however you want to define it, it's like so automatic. Like, I don't even think of that until I'm talking about it, where I'm like, no, like somebody's already kind of labeled this before. But yeah, when you're in the moment, it really is just that kind of like thinking ahead of, can I do both these things in one day?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Do you want to talk more about your pectus surgery?
Yeah. So, I got my regular imaging done, and the pectus has always been there. And then one day it was like, they really took a look at it, and they were like, I forget what the score is called, but it's like the ratio of across your ribs versus like the gap between your spine and your sternum. I hope I explained that right. But it's like a ratio, and normally it's like 2 or 3 is like the normal unaffected populations number. Mine was like 6.7.
Whoa.
So it was like very extreme. The gap between my sternum and the back of my, or the back of my sternum and the front of my spine was probably like 1.25 inches, 1.33 inches. My heart was kind of in the wrong spot. So like breathing was obviously an issue. I couldn't take deep breaths without just like my whole chest just kind of like shaking because there just wasn't enough space. I would run out of breath just getting dressed in the morning or like taking a shower.
Mm-hmm.
It was very much like a day-to-day thing, day-to-day struggle with it. And when they said like you'd be a good candidate for surgery, I just said sign me up, because if there's a way to not deal with this, I'll take it. I got it February of 2022 and fixed that, all that. The surgery was a success. It is probably considered one of the more painful surgeries, getting your bones readjusted like that. So pain was like astronomically bad for a bit. They did give me an epidural, but for whatever reason, probably related also to Marfan syndrome with the spine issues, it did not take. So that was very, very bad. And I remember like I went to therapy like after and like processing it then. I think that's when it really sunk in of like, no, like I was genuinely terrified. Like I remember thinking at one point, because it was so bad, I just couldn't breathe. And I remember thinking like, I don't know if I'm about to die, but I feel like this is how it starts. Because I thought maybe he had like punctured, like there had been maybe some kind of complication or some kind of puncture with my lung or like the diaphragm muscle that helps you breathe. I really was convinced that there was something very traumatic that had happened to it, because the pain was just incomprehensibly bad.
How long did it take to recover from that surgery?
6 months.
6 months.
Yeah. And during that time, can't drive, can't lift, can't do anything, can't even like push yourself up. So there was months I had to only sleep on my back. Not the most comfortable position for me.
Yeah.
So it was just like, again, like the day-to-day struggle of just everything kind of changed for a bit. I couldn't work, couldn't do anything. And it was such a mental struggle of just being isolated and having no control over the situation. And, there was no like physical rehab or recovery that I could have done to like expedite it. Like there was no benchmarks to hit. It was pretty much just hang out for 6 months, which sounds great in theory. In practice, it's awful.
Yeah.
Awful. And that's kind of when I got really into like just knitting and really wanting to be creative. It was kind of all I had. Like couldn't do anything really. Walking even was still too exhausting for the longest time, but I could just kind of sit and knit and listen to a podcast or listen to an album, something like that.
Yeah. So it's been, is it almost 3 years since that surgery now?
Yeah, it'll be 3 years of February 5th of 2025.
Can you breathe better? Is it a lot? Like,
yes. Yes. In the end, it was like at the time I was like, in the middle of it, I really was like, I think this is one of the most like worst decision I've done. Like I deeply regret it. And now I complete 180 on that. I love it. It was hard at the time, but the novelty of just being able to take a really deep breath and not being in pain and being able to do it, period, has not worn off. Like it's still like, I'll just be like chilling and think of like, I'm going to take a deep breath. Like I really will have this conscious thought of just, let me inhale because I can.
Yeah. That's a really funny way to put it. The novelty of being able to take a deep breath. I'm glad that you're able to do that now.
Thank you. It's great. It's wonderful. And it was kind of the thing of like, y'all have been living like this your entire lives. Like, I didn't know this. I've just been struggling for an indeterminate number of years. And yeah, it really was just like a huge change that I love and thoroughly enjoy.
That's awesome. So we've talked about your pectus surgery and the chronic pain that you deal with. Have you had to have surgery on your aorta, or how's your aorta doing?
It's pretty good. All things considered, it's growing. It's a little bit enlarged in certain places. It's kind of consistently growing in places probably around 1 millimeter a year.
Okay.
There are some that are definitely outside the normal range. Like they have just like the list of like your ascending, your descending sinus of Valsalva. I think there's maybe like one in there that's like within normal range. The rest are kind of enlarged. And that's, again, I've kind of made peace with it, but it does kind of, it's a balancing act in just the day-to-day life of like not living like there's this big dark cloud over me, that it can grow really fast, or this is kind of going to be down the road. This is inevitable. I think I've kind of struck a happy medium of being mindful of that while not being so like gloom and doom about things.
How do you do that?
It's, it's going to my doctor's appointments and just doing what I can, like focusing on that. When my dad was overseas, my mom would always say like one day at a time. And that's kind of what I try to do. I don't try to think of like what things are going to look like when I'm like 36. I don't want to sit here and do the numbers of like, okay, so if this is growing a millimeter a year, how many years do I have? My mind has kind of gotten there, and I'm like, I'm not even going to bother. I'm not getting out the scratch paper and figuring this out. Like, that's not going to help me. And I think that's kind of like the most important advice that I've given myself of like, I can't change that right now. I can't fix this right now, and it's not going to help me. So let's move on.
Yeah.
Again, so much of this it's so mental and emotional. Because, you can't control the physical aspects, but, you can control the mindset, and that's all I have. That's all I can control. So it is just taking care of myself and, trying to enjoy what I'm able to do. I think I would always kind of get stuck in that like negative mindset of like, this is the life I'm stuck with. I'm making the best of a bad situation. And now I'm like, well, I get to live this life that I have now, that I've cultivated over these years, and trying to always be optimistic about things, even when it's difficult, even if it's kind of like the most optimistic thing I can squeeze out of myself is like, I'm here. I can breathe. I can take a deep breath, like those kinds of things.
Yeah. So I know you mentioned earlier that you work at Emory. How did you kind of get into what you're doing with Alzheimer's and at Emory, and did Marfan syndrome kind of influence where you wanted your career to go, or how did you land where you are?
So it was a couple things that kind of influenced me. Emory is such an esteemed institution, especially in the Atlanta area. Everyone knows Emory. If you go to Emory, you're like super smart. If you work at Emory, like you must be really good at something. So I was just kind of really hoping that I would be able to say that I worked there. And I just knew it was like neurology under the School of Medicine. I didn't really know all the details. And then as I kind of went through the interview process, I found out that it was Alzheimer's Research Center. It was doing a lot of outreach. It was minority engagement. Atlanta has a big African American population, birthplace of Martin Luther King Jr. So those are always like cool things that I get to say, like I live in this wonderful historic city, and being able to play a part in helping people, reducing some suffering, and saying that I was a part of this team. I always say I'm like standing on the shoulders of giants with my outreach team. And it was very much a life-changing thing just from the jump of seeing the impact that they've already made over the years, and being able to make a difference and be a part of that kind of motivated me to be more involved in my own condition. I knew the Marfan Foundation existed, but I don't know, just like I was in college, I had an internship, I was too busy for the longest time. And then, this job, it was kind of like, no, like you can do something. Like there are so many things. You don't have to have like a doctorate, or you don't have to go to med school, or even like anything else. Like you can really just have a fundraiser. You can do so much. You can connect with people and share your story, and that can make a huge difference. And that was kind of motivated me. Of seeing it firsthand really drove me to try to do my part.
So seeing it firsthand through the work that you're doing for Alzheimer's and the community engagement there, and then taking that and then applying that towards your own story with Marfan syndrome.
Exactly. Yeah. I just seeing, everyone has a story, and even if it's, just connecting with somebody, and through that conversation, you're able to like motivate them to be involved in research, or talk to their doctor about, some concerns they're having. And that can be a huge difference. And even when we're kind of in the rush of like healthcare being like a rush kind of situation, just like having those like serious conversations can make a huge difference. So
yeah.
that's, yeah, just a big, if I can get people talking about it, then, I've done something good.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love that you're doing that.
Yeah.
And I guess for minority engagement and accessibility issues, what do you think is, I mean, I don't want to have you rank the different things that are important, right? But like, what are some of the most important areas that you see need improvement in the Marfan space for accessibility and minority care?
That's interesting. I definitely think just spreading awareness of all these related conditions, VEDS, Marfan syndrome, Loeys-Dietz, they're kind of variations of that. Because so many times, like, it can come in so many different ways. And, I think doctors kind of have to understand that it can take many formats, and they might have to, like, order a couple more tests and refer to a specialist. And it's, I think, just understanding the awareness situation of it and understanding how many forms these disorders can really take.
Yeah. Like, it's not like a one size fits all.
For sure. Yeah. And something I've talked to Ellen Hofsteller, she's the chief science officer with the John Ritter Foundation. And something that she brought up is, the Gantt criteria was made by someone in Belgium. And, sometimes those kind of ethnic criteria based kind of things, they may not translate to every single person. So there was somebody that she was telling me about. She had heard of somebody who was of Mexican descent, like me, who was 5'2", and she couldn't really kind of squeeze into any genetic testing spaces because she did not have that height situation. So I think it's really about understanding, it's not a one size fits all. It might not apply to everybody, but you really have to look under the hood and really take a look. And it can be really difficult with just, the insurance coverage. Not everyone can get to the most esteemed specialist. They might not have just the connections to know that. And something that I've seen, with my own family that I previously touched on is the language situation and certain like education and cultural backgrounds. With my family members, they just didn't understand the gravity of the situation, that it wasn't inevitable. They could do something about it. And it was something that could be as simple as maybe we add a beta blocker, and that gives us time to really take a look a little bit deeper.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's also important. And do you know, I mean, I feel like I should know this, but I'm under the impression that like hospitals are required to provide a translator. Do you know if that's true?
I don't think they are, because it's a bit of a courtesy. And if there's just, you speak something like Bangladeshi. I've met people who work in clinics, they speak Bangladeshi, they speak Nepalese. If they're in a setting where there's not that person, there's not somebody who's fluent in this language, what can you do? You just go, you can maybe point at things or try your best, but there's really so much you can do. The language can make just a huge difference in understanding it. A story that I like to tell that is I think it's funny, my family thinks it's funny, but my great grandma was kind of learning English, and somebody, a well-meaning American woman, was telling her about the military draft, and there was obviously the big language barrier. So my great grandma didn't entirely understand, and her takeaway was that the U.S. government was going to take away her kids.
Oh no!
That was kind of her takeaway from her military draft discussion. So she had all her children. She was living in Texas, and instead of having her kids in Texas, she went across the border so they would be Mexican citizens, and then the government couldn't take her children, was the mindset. Because she didn't understand.
Right.
So, even if like you are, maybe even a little proficient, or you know a little bit, but it's not a natural language, and you don't know this kind of like medical terminology down to like what a certain medicine could be, that can make a huge difference in your outcome and your treatment. And it's just so hard to really take that into consideration, and especially in certain areas. I know like certain counties here have a higher population of immigrants from certain regions. So it's very difficult. But, seeing the difference that certain clinics are making that the Alzheimer's Research Center partners with it's great. But I think nationwide, it's I don't think anyone's really leading the charge on that, which is very, very sad.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely something to address. I know that in some of the doctor's offices I've been in, they have like the phone number where you can call for a translator, but I've noticed like all of those signs are in English. So that doesn't really help either.
Yeah.
I think it is such an important issue, and I'm glad that you brought it up. I hope that somebody does take that charge, I guess,
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
It is such a common issue. It's, you might see the English, you might see just Spanish, and then that's pretty much call it a day, we're set. But there's so many languages being spoken in large numbers too, but it's like, how do you prioritize all this? And, sometimes there might be, I've heard of just like random people, literally just like another citizen that happens to speak the same language kind of coming in. And the issue there is if they're not necessarily like a trained person, they might be filtering the information a little bit. In a way, it's kind of like a game of telephone where they don't necessarily pass on everything 100% the way that the doctor intended or the way the patient intended to the doctor. So again, it's the thing of like getting lost in translation because they don't have a very like especially trained person just for this.
Right. Yeah. I would love to see some kind of legislation passed through to require things like services. We have so many different languages spoken in this country, and to have people unable to basically access their own healthcare because of that language barrier is a huge deal. Huge deal.
Yeah. Having insurance coverage is such a big part, but it can just be the start.
Yeah.
Like, how do you navigate everything? Do you have like a deductible? What's the copay? Like, it's just like its own language in its own way. So it's great that there are resources for people, especially people who have Medicare and Medicaid coverage, but it really is just a complete mess sometimes, and it's so hard to navigate. Just getting that doctor's appointment can really be just the first step in climbing a mountain.
Yeah. I want to ask you, like, you mentioned earlier the kind of bitterness that you went through when you were a teenager, and you've certainly overcome that time of your life as far as like the day-to-day bitterness, and you've gotten so involved and you do so much, not only in Marfan syndrome but also through your work with the Alzheimer's Research Center. If there was a teenager listening to you share your story today, and they're going through what you went through at that age when you were, whether it was not playing soccer anymore or watching your mom go through surgery and helping her with that surgery and feeling that like despair, what would you tell them? What advice would you have for that person?
I definitely don't want to just do the cliche of like, it gets better, but I don't know. I guess just not it gets better. I can't guarantee that, but so much will change. Your perspective, you'll grow. The circumstances will change. You're not going to be stuck living the same life. And, that's a reason just at the very least, you can start just being curious about your life and the future and the person you could be. And, that's a wonderful starting place to be, is just kind of have that curiosity about the future. My takeaway, and I'm going to share a tragedy of my life, was my friend in high school took her own life when we were both 16. And, something that makes me sad is just thinking of the changes that she missed out on. So I don't want to say there was a lesson from her passing, but, something that really helped me survive was thinking of, it's not going to be like this forever. So much can change. And, Yeah, that's, I think when I get in these like pits of despair periodically, it's like, I'm not curious about the future. I don't care. This is all that things will ever be. Nothing will ever change. And what really gets the gears rolling in the positive direction is, maybe it won't be like this. Maybe tomorrow something will happen. Next week something will happen. I can, go out and just do something kind of different than what I did today. And that can like snowball into something better.
Yeah.
But just knowing that something might happen that will just completely change your life, and you just kind of have to stick around for it and keep pushing.
Yeah. I think that's great advice. Is there something that you want medical professionals or researchers or medical students to take away from your story with Marfan syndrome and bring into their careers?
So I love the Golden Girls. I don't know if anyone else out there does, but there's this one episode, or like a 2-part episode, where Dorothy has like her own health scare, and she kind of confronts the doctor, who was very dismissive and rude towards her. And a quote that sticks with me is like, if every doctor at the beginning of their career could get very sick and very scared, maybe you would treat your patients better. Just being mindful of like the the doctors that I work with, they always talk about like, Dr. Google says this, and it's very dismissive, but people are experts in their own body. They know when something's wrong. 9 times out of 10, they're gonna be right when something is wrong, right? And I would say it's probably even higher than that, but lowballing it with a 9 out of 10. But yeah, just knowing that, like, being able to hear them, like, even if it is anxiety, like, it feels so real in the moment to that person. Like, just meet them where they are can be a game changer.
Yeah. And if you're out there listening to this and you want to learn more about Marfan syndrome, and this is like, if the first time that you've really learned about Marfan syndrome is from this episode, that's awesome. But if you want to learn more about it too, like the features and how to diagnose it and like all of that information, if you have a patient with Marfan syndrome and don't know where to send them to get support, there are links in the episode show notes for the Marfan Foundation, the Loeys-Dietz Syndrome Foundation, and the VEDS Movement for vascular EDS, and they all have support groups and webinars and ways to get together and ways to get involved and fundraise and do all sorts of stuff. There's also, as you mentioned, the John Ritter Foundation. You mentioned in this episode. I'll put a link to them down below in the episode, or down in the episode show notes too. And yeah, thank you for carrying this into your careers, and also caring enough to listen. Is there anything else that you want to share about your story before we end our time here today?
I guess just want to shout out to all my friends and family, of course, for just being so supportive of angsty teenage Marisa through it all. Love that for me, that I have such a great circle. And thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. I really, really appreciate your time and your energy and like everything that you're doing, and the honesty that you brought with you today to the episode too. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for spreading the message of Marfan syndrome. Appreciate that, of course.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to this episode featuring Marisa Hart sharing her story with Marfan syndrome. If you're ready to meet others, get involved, or you need support, there are links for you in the episode show notes, as well as information on research studies for people with VEDS, Marfan, and Loeys-Dietz, including for those with a VUS. If you like this show, be sure to share it on social media or give it a rating or review. You can also support the production of this podcast by joining my Patreon, making a one-time donation, or by buying merch. As always, my top tier patrons are listed in the episode show notes. In the next episode, we'll talk with Bella Marin, who was previously on the show several years ago to share her story with VEDS, or vascular Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. See you soon.